A reading from Mark 2, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God, when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do harm or to do good on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, just how to destroy him. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Sabbath is one of those things in the Bible that most of us agree is a good idea. But if we're being honest, basically none of us do it, or at least we don't do it very well. But I do want to take this time to really delve into that idea of Sabbath. The biblical seeds for Sabbath are planted in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, after God has done the work of creation, and we are told, "And on the 7th day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation." Chapters and verses weren't included in the Bible until roughly 500 years ago. And while it's incredibly convenient, it sometimes breaks up stories in a way that influences how we read them. And so the end of the 1st chapter of Genesis tells of God creating humans. And because it's the end of the chapter, we subconsciously read it as if it's like the end of the story. And because humans are the last thing created, we think, wow, humans, the pinnacle of the creation story. But when we actually finish the story, we realize that while, yes, the work of the creation may be finished after the 6th day, the story of creation is not complete. It's not done until God has rested and blessed and hallowed that 7th day. And why God rests is such an important question. And it's one where I don't believe the answer is as simple as, well, God was tired. I really think God made a choice to rest, and that choice is a pretty essential component of the character of God. When we look at God's activity in creation, it can be really tempting to get bogged down in the science of it all. Was it a literal 7 days? Are those days representative of longer periods of time? What even is God's relationship to time? These are good questions to bring to the text, but they miss the core of what's really happening in this story. The entirety of the world could have come into being with a snap of the Creator's fingers, but God didn't choose to work that way. God chose to draw things out more slowly than was absolutely necessary. God chose to speak things into existence, piece by piece. God chose to put God's hands in the dirt and breathe life into the nostrils of humanity. The way God chose to create was a labor of love. It was a practice of intimacy. But despite how God loved the world, despite the intimacy of God's relationship with the created order, God's choice to rest was this sort of letting go. God was not a helicopter parent to the creation that God had just birthed, seeking to tweak this thing or that to make sure there was no possibility for anything to go off the rails. No, God rested. And when the command to keep the Sabbath was given as the fourth out of the 10, it remembers God's activity or lack thereof in creation. In Exodus 20 we read, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that was in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it." I've spent some time with Walter Brueggemann's book, Sabbath as Resistance, saying no to the culture of now. And a lot of what I speak about in this sermon is influenced by what he writes. And as Brueggemann unpacks this fourth commandment and its mention of God's rest in the creation process, he lifts up 3 essential points. First, divine rest makes it clear that Yahweh is not a workaholic. Second, Yahweh is not anxious about the full functioning of creation. Third, the well-being of creation does not depend upon endless work. Creation did not stop being good when God took time to rest. Beloved community, taking time for Sabbath and rest is an act of resistance in the midst of a culture that defines us by our productivity and our production. And while that speaks directly to our culture today, it also speaks directly to the culture of the Hebrew people who were receiving that command. The 10 Commandments were given after the Exodus from Egypt, right? And in Egypt, the Hebrew people were enslaved and subject to endless labor. As Exodus 1 tells us, the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. And while the Israelites were definitely the oppressed in that society, we cannot forget that not a single person was free from this system of anxious and endless production. The taskmasters, as terrible as they were still a cog in the machine, driving the Israelites to produce more and more so that their jobs and their ability to feed their family was not on the line. Even Pharaoh himself instituted this system out of fear that the numerous Israelites would supplant his power. So nobody is free from this anxiety. Nobody is free from the anxiety-driven and anxiety-producing system. So imagine how radical it would have been to hear that God requires a work stoppage. And when we stop work, when we can take time to pause, we realize that other human beings, they aren't merely our threats or our competitors, but we are able to appreciate them as whole and complex human beings. When we engage in Sabbath, we realize that the created order is not merely a tool to utilize in order to produce more or to produce more efficiently, but it, in and of itself, is good. And while we probably like to think that we aren't so governed by this system of anxious production, I'm sure all of us can think of a classmate or coworker that we didn't really know, but we harbored this strange resentment towards them because they were able to produce better test results, better sales figures, better pitches than we were, and they seemed to succeed so effortlessly. But the reality is that almost never does anybody else's success actually threaten our own, and yet we are conditioned to view everyone else's production or success as a threat to our own, because we too are trapped in a system of anxious production. Or so it seems, because God's command declares that we, as those created in the image of a God who rests, are not governed by this anxious production. Rather, when we rest, when we live into this aspect of the image of God, we resist and provide a powerful no to the surrounding culture. We model what it's like to live as God intends us to live. And you see, Sabbath isn't just about our individual no, because when we keep Sabbath, Everyone rests. The commandment says, "But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns." When fully lived out, Sabbath is a great equalizer. The powerful and the seemingly powerless rest. The animals rest. The land rests. All of us are in this together. We are all equally at rest. As Walter Brueggemann says, in a society defined by production and consumption, there are huge gradations of performance, and therefore of worth and significance. And in such a social system, everyone is coerced to try and perform better. But Sabbath breaks that gradation, because this one day breaks the pattern. All are like you, equal worth, equal value, equal access, equal rest. In this way, Sabbath is a statement of solidarity with our neighbors, an act of resistance against a society that would pit us against each other. And keeping in mind that Sabbath is intended to help us love our neighbors as ourselves, and to love our neighbors well, we can better understand Jesus' teachings about the Sabbath and his disdain for the way it had been distorted and turned into this big list of do's and don'ts. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus has to deal with questions about the Sabbath towards the very beginning of his public ministry. Mark 2 tells us, right, that Jesus and his disciples were going through the grain fields and were plucking the heads of grain. They were criticized for this, and Jesus responds with the story of David and his companions breaking the Sabbath when they were hungry, before telling those who criticize him, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. Jesus then goes into the synagogue where there was a man with a withered hand. Those who had offered criticism were watching to see if Jesus would offer healing. And before healing the man, Jesus asks his critics, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? And the critics were silent, which both angered and provoked grief in Jesus. Because what had happened to the Sabbath that God had commanded, the Sabbath that was about honoring the image of God and loving our neighbor? Like all things, Sabbath can be overrun by legalism and just turn into a list of what to do and what not to do. And it's not difficult to understand why. So many of us are really uncomfortable in living in that gray area. And when I've talked about Sabbath before, so many people have asked me, and these are questions I've also asked in the past, well, what am I supposed to do on Sabbath days? Do I spend the whole time in prayer and worship? Am I allowed to hang out with my friends? And there is no easy answer. But I do think the fact that both Jesus and David ate with their companions indicates that the Sabbath does not need to be a solitary day of traditional individual spirituality with a hyper-focus on prayer and study. I think the fact that Jesus healed on the Sabbath indicates that we can care for the needs of others on the Sabbath. I think the fact that Jesus was grieved when folks were unable to affirm that doing good and tending to life were the right things to do indicates that we should do things that tend to life. But the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. And since each of us is fearfully and wonderfully made, uniquely made, the things that tend to my life may not tend to your life. So there is no easy answer in terms of what one should do during Sabbath time. But, as is evidenced through the words of several prophets, there is a difference between false and true Sabbaths. And the one I want to point out is in Amos. Through the prophet, God says, "Hear this, you that trample on the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale?" While they technically observe the work stoppage of the Sabbath, their minds are divided. The whole time they're thinking about getting back to work. And this reminds me of conversations I've had with so many of the college students I've worked with. So many of them, when I've asked them how they're doing, they've told me stories of the fun they've had with friends, the cool things they've done, but then they'll end with, "But I wasn't productive enough today." Or even on days when all we do is sleep late and watch TV, we also complain about how we aren't productive enough. Somehow, productiveness has become the measure of the goodness of a day. And that is tragic. Because when I ask you to think about your most favorite days, not a single one of you would tell me stories about a day when you got a bunch of things done. You would tell stories of time with family and friends, incredible vacations, encounters with God that knocked you off of your feet. You're not going to tell me about a day when you somehow managed to cross everything off of your to-do list. When we spend a whole day of supposed rest, feeling guilty, and thinking about all that we have to do, we aren't actually keeping Sabbath. And in this culture, we're taught to wear our busyness as a badge of honor. So many of us constantly talk about how we don't have time for anything fun, how we don't have a life outside of work or maybe school. And this is not what God desires for us, beloved community. This is antithetical to who God is and who God invites us to be. So many of us are imprisoned by the idea of wasting time. If we aren't producing something measurable, somehow what we're engaged in is a waste. But the time that we have is a gift, and Sabbath is a particular expression of the gift of time. And God, who is the giver of all good gifts, intends for this gift of time to help us to break the cycle of anxious production, to offer solidarity and neighbor love, and to bring us joy and deeper communion with God. When I get imprisoned in the hows and whats of Sabbath keeping, unable to break that cycle of anxious production in the way that God calls all of us to, I return to a Mary Oliver poem entitled Wild Geese. It reads thus: You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. You do not have to be what the world defines as good or productive. You only have to let your body, let yourself love what it loves. The world will go on when we step away. It will not fall apart. Frankly, we do not have that much power. But we do have a home. We have a place. We have a family. All of that is offered to us through God. And keeping the Sabbath is how we receive it. Amen. May it be so.